Okay. Hi. I'm ka-en-byou. No relation. I've been planning on doing this for a while. I hinted at the last, I guess, quote-unquote video I put up that I was planning to do a bit of a lecture type thing. You know, slideshows are all the rage these days on YouTube among weirdos like me. This was originally going to be a thing that I made because I didn't have a real computer, and a slideshow is just kind of a real sort of low system overhead thing. But a real computer fell into my lap anyway, so thanks to my brother for that. But I figured this would be a fun way to kind of ease myself back into doing stuff, so I figured I would give you all a fully accurate preview, because a lot of what I want to do going forward is going to be more predicated on like thematic, narrative analysis. If it's like a video game, then maybe it'll be mechanical analysis too, or like design sort of stuff. But this is more kind of focused on like linguistics and I guess general literary critique in a way. But it's a subject which I am very interested in, and I hope it is something that you'll all get something out of as well. So welcome, and thank you for attending my lecture on Kamen Rider Den-O, TV Nihon, and the art of translation. So a few disclaimers before we really get into the weeds here. The first is that I am not a professional translator. I am not a trained linguist, and I'm on balance not really even all that good at speaking Japanese. I have studied Japanese in both formal and informal settings for a very long time, since I was in like middle school. And I've spent a lot of time running in a lot of Japanese speaking circles, both online and in real life. So I can hold my own, but I'm not passing the JLPTN one anytime soon. So I am not what you might call fluent in Japanese. I just know my way around identifying kanji and using a dictionary, if that gives you an indication of the sort of level that I'm at. I am also not in the business of creating fan subs. I am, however, friends with a few people who established the group Excite Subs. So I'm very like casually informed about the process of creating subtitles and of translating for them as well. So for all of this, I am not an expert in the academic sense. So consider me so this is like a casually informed layperson's perspective. Let's put it that way. I feel that I know enough to speak confidently on the things that I'm going to be speaking about, but I am not an authority. Do not cite me in any academic essays. And finally, we're going to be talking about TV Nihon, and we're specifically going to be criticizing their translation stylings. But this is going to be good faith critique. We're not going to be taking pot shots. I'm not going to be calling anyone lazy or incompetent or anything like that. So, in many ways, I actually have tried to be very fair in my critique and in the ways in which I do not actually critique TV Nihon, but the perspective is very useful. But this is not This is not a teardown. This is not a roast. This is an analysis. Okay? Cool. Let's get into it for real. And to start, let's set the stage. And to do that, we're going to talk about different philosophies or approaches one can take to literary translation. So we're talking about translating literary works, not just books, but also, anything like, from scripts to comics, TV shows, especially TV shows in this particular instance. So there are a few different approaches that you can take to literary translation. And to start, from brass tacks, I want to emphasize that the perspective I'm coming at this from, and the perspective that I hope you'll be able to appreciate in this lecture, is that literary translation is itself a literary art form. I believe that in order to be a good translator, you have to be at least a decent writer, which also means that translation, much like any other form of creative writing exercise, is subject to stylistic differences of opinion and different stylistic priorities. And these different, opinions and priorities can manifest in a whole bunch of different ways. But for the purposes of our discussion, I want to split these varied approaches into two broad philosophies of translation, which we're going to call pure translation and localization. So we'll start by talking about pure translation. So pure translation is kind of exactly what it sounds like. The goal of pure translation as a philosophy of literary translation is to more or less try as much as you can to create a one-to-one recreation of the script, of the original script, into the target language. And this often maintains things like language-specific cultural references and idioms, and it will also frequently involve the use of things like translator's notes to provide context or clarification for certain words or phrases to the audience. If I were to try and summarize the artistic intent of pure translation, it'd be this. A literary work is best understood in as close to its original cultural and linguistic context as possible. Any significant deviations of content from the original script represent a kind of compromise on the artistic integrity of the original work and end up creating an entirely new work rather than a strict recreation of the original work. So the intent of pure translation is to just kind of try and transplant a work from one language into another. By contrast, we have the perspective of localization. Now, if pure translation is to kind of just try and transplant a work from one language into another, then localization is the process of trying to really fully integrate it into the cultural norms of whatever target language you're working with. So the goal of localization is to try and translate your original script into the target language in a way that makes the translation feel naturalistic. And this often involves taking a lot of artistic license with the translation. Since a lot of elements like cultural references and language-specific idioms can't usually be translated directly from one language into another because the ideas and context just sort of get lost along the way. The translation from a localization perspective will frequently take the approach of trying to translate ideas and concepts rather than words directly. And so to try and, I guess, summarize the artistic intent of localization, it'd be to say that translating a work of literature is necessarily going to result in a different work of art, whether you like it or not. So with that being the case, a translation should make the script maximally legible to the audience, both in terms of pure linguistic function and cultural context. Now, it's worth stressing, both of these approaches are useful and they are not mutually exclusive. Each of these two approaches have their place within any given work of translation, and good translators will often make use of both approaches to varying degrees depending on what the work calls for. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that one of these approaches is better than the other, but I do think that one of these approaches has more weaknesses than the other if you were to analyze it from the perspective of, like, if you were to lean into one or the other more, which we'll get into. So that's our stage set. Now let's talk about our main player. So who is TV Nihon? So TV Nihon, or TVN for short, are a legacy subtitling outfit that was first established in 2002. They've done some work on a bunch of anime, but for the most part, their focus in terms of translating and subtitling has been in the realm of tokusatsu, where they particularly focused on providing English subtitles for Kamen Rider and Super Sentai. TVN were the kind of primary and really only subtitling group that operated in the English-speaking tokusatsu space in the period of 2002 to about 2010. And that was around the time where groups like Overtime started to show up. And TV Nihon still operates today, but the translation and subtitling space in tokusatsu is a lot more vibrant, I suppose. There's a lot more subtitling groups and also a lot more individual efforts running around as well. Now, in terms of what TV Nihon is known for, they're mostly known for their visual flair. They tend to use a lot of really distinct font choices, and they have a lot of graphics that appear during their, during transformation sequences and stuff. They have graphics that they use in the subtitles. But most importantly for our discussion here, one of the defining features of TV Nihon is they are very much in the pure translation camp as far as their approach to translation. And that's our main player, which leaves us to just establish the scene, which brings us to the question, what is Kamen Rider Den-O? So, Kamen Rider Den-O was the season of Kamen Rider that aired between 2007 and 2008. And notably, Kamen Rider Den-O is one of the most enduringly popular seasons of the show. Everybody knows Kamen Rider Den-O in Japan. Den-O has had the most crossover appearances with other Kamen Riders as well as Super Sentai compared to any other Kamen Rider. Kamen Rider Den-O even appeared a couple of years ago in a crossover with Avataro Sentai Don Brothers, a show that aired over 15 years after Kamen Rider Den-O did. So it is one of the most enduringly popular seasons of the show. And it's popular because it bucked a trend. most seasons of Kamen Rider before Den-O were various shades of dark. They were more grounded, or they were more kind of violent, explored a lot of harsher themes. And Den-O in particular became a massive hit with families, and especially children, by having a focus on this colorful cast of, you know, really zany oddball characters, and also by employing a lot of comedy, particularly of the slapstick variety. So this was a very cartoony show that kind of brought a lot of levity to Kamen Rider that was sorely missing in the years leading up to 2007. All of that being said, despite its image as being the most for kids season of Kamen Rider Den-O is a notoriously difficult script to translate. Its most enduring legacy in the fan subbing community is literally killing subtitling groups. The most recent attempt at completely retranslating Den-O, as far as I'm aware, was done by Orange Lion back in the time of around like 2016 to 2017. And they didn't make it past episode 19 before they just disappeared off the face of the earth. And as a preface to all of the criticisms that we're going to make of TV Nihon's translation of Kamen Rider Den-O, it has to be said that TV Nihon is the only group to have actually completed a translation for Den-O. They are the only group that say that they have seen Den-O to the end. No other group has done that. But then obviously that begs the question, well, why is Kamen Rider Den-O so difficult to translate? And the main thing to understand is that Kamen Rider Den-O is a show that, again, despite its for kids image, its script is full of highly specific wordplay and characters who just talk weird. And these two things often intersect. So character catchphrases form the basis of puns that are used not only in future episodes of the show, but also in titles of supplementary media, which means that if you're trying to approach a translation for this show, your translations need to be really well thought out and planned out well in advance. Their translations require a level of cohesion and forethought that is kind of not required in many other children's shows. So we have the stage, the players, and the scene. So now we can start talking about the real meat. How does TV Nihon translate Kamen Rider Den-O? And I think TV Nihon's pure translation attitude towards Den-O manifests in three different ways. Those being mistranslations, overly literal translations, and outright non-translations. Now, for mistranslations, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time focusing on those because they are not really... We can't really criticize them for mistranslations here because one of the really great tools that fan subbing groups have access to now is like actual scripts for episodes of currently airing shows. Groups like, or even individual efforts like Geo subs, Genmu subs, Excite subs, Izu subs even, they all have access to scripts based on closed captions for recently released Kamen Rider seasons. This was not the case in the early to mid 2000s. TV Nihon did not have access to these scripts, which meant that episodes had to be transcribed by ear before they could be translated, which is presumably how we get some notable mistranslations from Kamen Rider Den-O, such as Ladies and Gentlemen, Banana New Shoe, which was meant to be Ladies and Gentlemen, Madame et Monsieur, or Sieg's catchphrase, Korin Mamo Jiste, getting translated as Advent to the top. I do want to note here that Korin does mean Advent, but Mamo Jiste is a set phrase in Japanese meaning that something is long awaited. So this is really kind of more like saying, behold my long awaited advent. Personally, I don't know how you would have to mishear Mamo Jiste to get to the top, but I wasn't there, so I won't speculate. I can't weigh in on that. I'll just count it as an honest mistake. But those are the mistranslations. They're the least important. They're things that we can't really criticize TVN for because of the environment they were working in at the time. But I would be remiss in not at least mentioning Ladies and Gentlemen, Banana New Shoe, because it's really funny. Anyway, next we have the overly literal translations, and there are a few ways that this shows up, which can result in some sort of clunky feeling sentences, and that's kind of the key thing. So lots of words and phrases in the pure translation ethos get translated extremely literally, even when the end result feels clunky or doesn't make a whole lot of sense in grammatical English. They're in their translation of the opening, the lyrics for the opening theme in Den-O, they translate. So there's the line "Imasugu ni yuko yakusoku no basho," and they translate "yakusoku no basho," which as a place of promises, which is, you can say that yakusoku no basho. Yakusoku meaning promise and basho meaning place, place of promises. That is a technically correct translation, but I don't think place of promises is going to be a phrase that means something to anybody, and it doesn't really strike me as the meaning of the phrase as well. Imasugu ni yuko yakusoku no basho. But another really important way that this shows up is in the lore-important designator of tokuiten. So, Kamen Rider Den-O is a time travel show, which means that it has time travel mechanics that can be a little wonky, but the core idea is that in Kamen Rider Den-O, the flow of time is directly connected to the memories of people who exist in any given time period. So a tokuiten in the show is a person whose memories are unaffected by changes to the timeline and thus act as an anchoring point for time to latch onto. They kind of help to stabilize the flow of time in the show. Now, tokuiten literally just means singularity, as in like the physics term singularity. And so you could translate it as such. You could just say, well, the word just means singularity. We will say it's singularity. I think this is fine, but it's a little jargony for my taste, and it's a little unclear in how someone being a singularity kind of denotes their relationship to time. I prefer Orange Lion's translation of tokuiten as temporal outlier, because even though that isn't the exact meaning of tokuiten, it still kind of communicates the general feel of what tokuiten means, while making the term's relationship with time a little more intuitive to the audience. TV Nihon, on the other hand, translated tokuiten as singularity point, presumably because they took the ten, which does in fact mean point, a little more literally. So they took the tokuiten as singularity point. Now, aside from the point thing, which is kind of a minor quibble, I do think that the translation is still weaker for not taking that extra artistic license in order to clearly outline what makes a tokuiten so tokui in the show. The toku basically just means like special or unique in that. So there's a little Japanese language joke for you guys. Another way that these overly literal translations in TV Nihon's translation of Kamen Rider Den-O manifest is in a couple of character catchphrases. Now, while I do believe that these are worth pointing out, these catchphrases are notably difficult translations, so this is, I am being as fair to TV Nihon as I possibly can. These translations are frankly Herculean tasks. I haven't been able to figure it out yet, but they're useful examples, so I want to point them out. So we're going to look at the catchphrases for two main characters, Kintaros and Ryutaros. Now, Kintaros's catchphrase is "Ore no tsuyosa ni omae ga naita," which roughly means "my strength has made you cry." And that in terms of representing the words and their grammatical function it's 100% correct. The problem is that naita is the past tense form of naku, meaning to cry. So he's saying, my strength has made you cry. The problem is that he always says this before a fight happens. So when you translate this phrase as my strength has made you cry, the phrase kind of feels grammatically and temporally out of place in English. The only solution I can really think of is that he's using like the prophetic perfect tense, which is something that exactly nobody knows about. And I really don't feel like Kintaros is the type of character to speak in that manner anyway. But I don't know. This is not a criticism. TV Nihon translated the words in front of them. Finding a decent translation for this catchphrase is, again, a frankly Herculean task. But it's kind of worth pointing out that this is one of those like overly literal translations. This applies again to Ryutaros' catchphrase, where he says, "Taoshite mo ii, kotae wa kiite nai," which is often translated as "mind if I kill you? Can't hear you." And again, so this is not the most literal translation, but it is still a little awkward, because while kotae wa kiite nai does in fact mean I can't hear you, or well, specifically it means I can't hear your answer. In English, these two phrases of mind if I kill you, can't hear you, feel a little disconnected from each other. And so it just the translation just kind of feels a little clunky as a result, in my opinion. Personally, I think that a better choice would be something like saying, instead of saying can't hear you, say, not that I'm listening, or I don't care what you think, I don't need your permission. Something like that, that would kind of better represent this childishly defiant attitude that defines Ryutaros as a character. So I kind of feel like can't hear you is more trying to translate the letter of the phrase rather than the spirit, which is maybe part of the point. But now, we can talk about the arguably most prominent and obvious manifestations of TV Nihon's pure translation approach. They're non-translations. I have seen this referred to as the Kisama-tachi approach for reasons that we will get into. But first, let's talk about Japanese honorifics. So anybody with a reasonable knowledge of the Japanese language knows that Japanese has these things called honorifics. They are kind of suffixes that go at the end of names, or second person pronouns, and they inform manners of address based on different social dynamics. And they kind of change. It's a fairly intricate system that sort of where manners of address change depending on the relationship between speakers. Now, it's worth noting that there are plenty of very good reasons to keep honorifics in the subtitles of your translation, especially if the quote-unquote Japanese-ness of the setting is important to the story. Obviously, this is a decent enough choice for Kamen Rider, considering that it all takes place in Japan. But of course, Persona 5 or Persona 3 and 4 even, which focus on that daily high school life in Japan, would warrant maintaining the honorifics as well. Not to mention that the social character of honorifics doesn't really map super cleanly to any linguistic concepts in English. We can sort of represent them approximately with different titles and such, but there's no way to really maintain the tone and precise meaning of things like Ona-san, Ryotaro-kun, Hana-chan in English. They're not fully translatable, and so that's another good reason to keep honorifics in the subtitles. However, it is also worth noting that some honorifics in Japanese do not serve a social purpose and only fulfill a grammatical role. A pertinent example for our purposes here is the honorific tachi, which is used to refer to a group of people associated with the person being addressed. So, if I were, say, talking to my friend Takeru, and I wanted to talk about something that Takeru and his friends were doing, I would be able to refer to that group of people as Takeru Tachi. So Takeru and the people associated with Takeru right now. And this concept, this group of people address, we don't have a word for that in English, but it's something that can be very easily represented in English with a number of very valid options. Why don't you go ask, Takeru's gang, let's talk to, I wonder what Takeru's crew is up to, So why did TV Nihon not bother to translate the phrase Yuto-kun Tachi? I love this screenshot, by the way, but this is not a translation. I think this is a very weak subtitling choice, personally. But that's one example. Another example is in the world famous catchphrase of Momotaro's "Ore Sanjo." Now, this is a really interesting phrase because Sanjo technically just means to arrive or to visit upon. Sanjo, it's a suru verb. Sanjo suru. It's got a very plain meaning. Again, arrive or visit upon. However, the word sanjo has a particular cadence and meaning associated with it that precludes it from being used in ordinary speech. And particularly when combined with the first-person pronoun ore, the kind of informal, gruff, masculine first-person pronoun, the entire phrase is really less of an everyday announcement and it's more of a wrestling introduction. This is a pro wrestling introduction, if you were to think about it in terms of its theatricality and projected arrogance. Now, the commonly accepted translation of this catchphrase, as we can see from the official subtitles provided from the YouTube release of Kamen Rider Den-O episode 1 on the Toei Tokusatsu channel, is "I have arrived." and this is quite a plain translation, but it's the commonly accepted translation, and this translation of Ore Sanjo actually started with TV Nihon's translation of the phrase in a translator's note. As you can see, TV Nihon translated and subtitled Ore Sanjo as Ore Sanjo. So what's wrong with this? What is actually the problem? What's my major malfunction with this particular approach to translation? Now, again, I want to stress there are plenty of worthwhile reasons to translate some things more literally or maintain otherwise untranslatable concepts in their original form when you're translating a work. There's plenty of good reasons to do those things. But I think that TV Nihon leans a little too hard into this particular, into the pure translation philosophy. And I think the problem with this particular approach is twofold. The first is that I think it assumes far too much knowledge on the part of the audience. And the second is that, frankly, I think it does a disservice to the script. So, even if translators' notes are used for when you're translating certain things or not translating certain things, be that as it may, leaving words and phrases untranslated is, I think, kind of asking the audience to pick up the slack. Which kind of means that the translation carries an implied assumption that the audience has a degree of familiarity with the source language. Now, when we're talking about adults who are watching Kamen Rider, I guess that's not really an unreasonable assumption to make, but I still kind of think it defeats the purpose of translation. You know, if you're going to assume some level of familiarity with the Japanese language, then why not just get people to watch the Raws, you know? But more importantly, I think that this overly literal approach to translation robs the script of its creativity. Like, the words being translated in this script aren't just words floating around in abstract space. They're words that are being said by characters in a story, and I think that overly literal translations, as well as the non-translations that we looked at, deny the characters their ability to be characters in the target language. So let's take a look at Ore Sanjo again. If we simply translate it as "I've arrived," I mean, that gets the point across, but I think that the phrase demands a lot more bombast and hot-headedness than that. I've arrived doesn't really show the full extent of Momotaro's personality. And I think it does a lot more for Momotaro's character if you take a little more artistic license with the translation. You know, maybe you get him to say something like, you know, "I'm here to kick your ass," or, you know, Den-O's a train show. Maybe we lean into a train pun. You know, we say, you know, "Looks like I'm right on time." You can work with that. Or, you know, if we look at even smaller examples, we have this scene here of Momotaro's mispronouncing Deneb's name as Odebu, effectively calling him fat or tubby. This exact pun doesn't work in English because we don't have a word for fat that sounds like Deneb. So this is a very Japanese language exclusive bit of wordplay. That said, I think that leaving the joke untranslated and just adding a translator's note robs the wordplay of its humor, because at this point you're not telling a joke, you're explaining a joke. In this case, I think that as a translator, you would be better off taking the approach of trying to translate the fact that there is a joke rather than trying to translate the joke. Again, referring to the Orange Lion translation of this scene, which also made its way into the OZC live scrub, this bit of wordplay was translated as having Momotaros mispronounced Deneb as denim. Which, again, that doesn't fully maintain the original joke, but in that instance, all you can really do if you're looking to do more than just explain the joke is try and maintain the fact that there is a joke in the first place. Now, to kind of wrap things up, in extra fairness to TVN, again, translation is really hard. This is not easy work. And there are, obviously, there are a lot of instances where TVN's translation of Den-O is not as literal as it could be. They do still have to take some creative license. And when they do that, it tends to work quite well. And frankly, if they didn't do that, there wouldn't be any translation at all. Not to mention that, again, TVN is the only subgroup to have actually completed a translation of Den-O, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that this overly literal, pure translation approach is like a big part of that. I think it would have saved them a lot of headaches trying to figure out how to make the puns work, especially if they're releasing this on a weekly basis. So this isn't really like a critique of TVN necessarily, as much as it is an exercise in using TVN as an example of why you might want to consider a translation that takes a little more artistic license with the content of the script. Because again, translation is a creative writing exercise. And I think if you come away from this with anything, I want that to be that because translation is a creative writing exercise, treating it that way is the best way to honor the source material if you are translating any literary work. And one last thing, if you're planning to translate Kamen Rider Den-O at all, make sure you spend a lot of time thinking about how you're going to translate the various puns, and make sure you have this all worked out before you begin translation in earnest. Remember, the title of the canon mid-season movie is a pun on Momotaros' catchphrase. And that's all I've got for you. So, thanks for attending my lecture. I hope to see some lively discussion. And otherwise, I will see you all for whatever counts as my next academic exercise on here. Bye!